Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Much better. This is why y'all are good GT students. All right, so I'm going to start off by handing the mic to a friend and colleague, somebody who's very well known around the area, former president of the Houston League of Women Voters, Dr. Amy Johnson-Benefield, who is today with us from the Houston Voting Initiative. And they have a table outside over here to make sure that you check your voter registration status, that you can sign up to register to vote. Today is the last day to sign up to register to vote in the November election. So she's going to tell you how to take care of that.
Good morning. I'm so excited about being here. This is my stomping ground, so I love having events, and so this is part of it. I have a QR code out there that you can just check your registration status and you will know whether it's active or inactive. If it's inactive, then you need to register because this is the last day. And if you have family and friends who need to register, I have some voter registration applications that you can take, but it has to be postmarked today. If you register today, I will take them into the office on tomorrow and turn them in. I have till 4:30 tomorrow afternoon to get them in to do that. So I'm excited. I want to just remind you that democracy is not a spectator sport where you have the luxury of coming into the arena and watching from the bleachers as things unfold on the floor, but rather it's a gladiator sport where you have to get into the arena and you have to fight for the things that you believe in. If you want equality, if you want equity, if you want justice, you have to fight for those things. And the way that you do that is through voting. That's one of the ways in which you do. That's the primary important way in which you do that. So I'm out there to register people to vote. Voter education information, so about the election, places you can go to find the resources that you need. For Patrick's class, I bought some voters guides. He will also give them the link so you can have it electronically, look up the candidates to know who you're voting for, what the issues are, and what's important to you. So thank you. Go Timberwolves!
Thank you, Dr. Benefield. We're also happy to have some other special guests in here. Dr. Leanne Nutt, the president of the college. And Vice President of Instruction, Rosewood Park. So, thank you for being here. And then, of course, your highly esteemed political science professors back there. Dr. Gilbert, Dr. Cannon, Dr. Hastings. All right. But you haven't come to see us. You see us every day. So, my name is Corey Colby. I'm a professor of political science here at Lone Star College-Tomball. And a few months ago, a friend of mine and colleague published something with his co-author that ended up being on a presidential debate stage. And this is not the first time it's been out there, but maybe the first time it's been brought up in a presidential debate. And it was regarding the ranking of presidents. And a lot of times of course, we get embedded with the presidents that we like the most, but we don't really have rational thoughts about that. We're like, oh, they're great, right? They're cool. They're from our party, so they automatically are better. So what Professor Rottinghouse does is uses a group of individuals to put some numbers to this, right? And he's going to talk to you today about how to do that. So my friend and guest today is Dr. Brandon Rottinghouse from the University of Houston. You may have heard him if you listen on NPR or view PBS from the Party Politics podcast. He also works with the Presidential Readiness Project. You may have seen the book on the sign-in table back there. He just recently released a book about Governor Rick Perry called Rick Perry, A Political Life. And let's see, what else do? You do the statistics and polling down there with the undergrads who are interested in that. So I don't know what he does in his spare time, but it seems like he doesn't have any. But I want y'all to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Brandon Rottinghouse from the University of Houston.
Just like you, I just noticed that. So, yeah.
Well, great minds, right? Number of tones. How are you all? How's the semester going? Good. All right, yeah. It's at that point where things start to get real. I am very encouraged to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I always like to come visit, and I've been friends with Corey for a long, long time. We've done a bunch of projects together, so it's great to get to see you all here and talk a little bit about presidential readiness.
So my colleague Justin Vaughn and I have spent a lot of years doing these surveys, and as Professor Colby said, we basically survey the individuals who are doing, more or less who are kind of in the kind of sphere. People who are writing books, people who are writing articles, people who are in the kind of subsection for the American Political Science Association. This is basically kind of an accumulation of the knowledge that we've come to over the past 3 or 4 surveys to give us a sense of how this works. Okay. So here's a few details about this. So as I said, my colleague is Justin Vaughn, who's at Coastal Carolina. He is probably golfing right now. If you know Coastal Carolina, it's pretty much known for football and for beaches, so you can definitely enjoy a little time there. But we spent, as I said, years putting together these surveys to understand how we think about presidential readiness. I'll talk a little bit about why we care about this and the ways that we do it, but just to preview this, basically we're interested in the ways that we reify the presidents. You've probably taught or learned in classes about the ways that these are kind of unfolding and how we assume kind of the branches of shared power. But realistically what's happening is that basically the president is sort of one cog in this bigger machine, but it's a supersized role, right? You have to agree. What the president does or doesn't do has a significant effect on what the country does and what the world does. So thinking about how that manifests in terms of the kind of separation of powers and in terms of our understanding of the ways that politics works is really important. So that's kind of why we decided to investigate this. Like I said, and as Professor Colby mentioned, we have this project. We migrated everything to this website, the Presidential Readiness Project. You can go there and search for some things. One other thing you can search for too that I'll note is, although it's not about the presidency, it's about the vice presidency. We've got some interesting details there that I'll share as well, because we don't tend to think about vice presidents as having greatness, but we do have a kind of over time way to explain the sort of number 2 in command. So there's details about that too. So you can go to the website, you can see a bunch more stuff. I summarized it here in part to give us a sense of how this has played out in the most recent version. So we got a lot of press of this. We released this on President's Day. We did an op-ed in the LA Times, and it got picked up by a bunch of different institutions. So Hill and NPR, Axios, and the New York Times, among many others. We definitely couldn't control what people wrote about or how they interpreted it. That was frustrating in a way, because it's the kind of thing where if you've ever been sort of viral, I suppose you'd say, it is not altogether controllable, and that creates obvious inference problems for how we as social scientists explain what we're doing and how we're doing it. So you can read all these articles and you'll come up with like as many explanations as there are articles about how we approach this. We got a lot of mail, some of it very positive, some of it very negative, from all across the political spectrum. People who said Donald Trump was rated too low, people who said that Joe Biden was rated too high, some people who said Joe Biden wasn't rated high enough. We also got mail from people who thought that Rutherford B. Hayes was unnecessarily pilloried in our survey. I don't know why people assume that Rutherford B. Hayes should be higher than he was. He seems actually pretty set in our ranking, which I'll show you, pretty low to the bottom, but I guess that you've got your Rutherford B. Hayes fans out there, and they definitely don't like it when he's talked of badly. The people who were happy, though, are, of course, people at the top, like Abraham Lincoln. So the Lincoln Foundation was very excited. They tweeted this out saying, once again, Abraham Lincoln is the nation's greatest president. I don't know if that'll ever change, although we have seen some interesting changes at the very top. So I'll talk about what that looks like here in a second. It's a sort of variation over time on this, but it's interesting to note that although we assume this is fixed, literally fixed, like Mount Rushmore, it's not. These things are fluid, and how do we reinterpret the kind of presidency and the way things evolve, we're likely to see these changes come across. So if you saw the debate, the first debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, then you may have remembered this little reference point. Could you play that clip for me? Hopefully you can hear it.
And by the way, worst president in history, 159 presidential scholars voted for him the worst president in the history of the United States of America.
Joe, our country is being destroyed as you and I sit up here and waste a lot of time on this debate. This shouldn't be a debate. He is the worst president. He just said it about me because I said it. But look, he's the worst president in the history of our country. He's destroyed our country.
The idea that we're talking about worst presidents, I wasn't joking. Look it up, go online. 159 or 58, don't know the exact number, presidential historians, they've had meetings and they voted who was the worst president in American history. One to best to worst. They said he was the worst in all of American history. That's a fact. That's not conjecture. He can argue they're wrong, but that's what they voted.
Well, one thing we didn't do is meet. This is a survey, so I'll talk about what the specifics look like in a second. Here it is, perfect, thank you. The survey basically is, as many surveys are, sort of done virtually. This is a purposeful survey, so we identified people who were in the presidency field. People who had written books, people who had written articles, people who were involved in various projects in and around this issue. We surveyed them from November to December of last year. So as it notes here, basically this is a grouping of people who were in this organized professional section or people who had published in various places. We ended up with about 525 respondents total from this kind of general yield. Ultimately, we got about 154 usable responses, which is a response rate of about 30%. This is basically on par with where it was in the prior year, so we're more or less hitting our numbers, but that's not an overwhelming number, and it's that way on purpose. This is a survey of experts, and these are people who, in theory, know how the presidency functions and how it's functioned over time. So just some technical things. We had to draw people who didn't say that they would agree to take the survey. If you go on to do any survey work, or if you have any kind of class-based survey work, one of the things that will be required is that you have basically people's consent in order to facilitate the survey. We ended up having to drop people who didn't confirm that they would do it. We also had to drop people who didn't complete the survey. So they come in, answer a few questions, and then stop. I don't know if you would ever do that, but if you are ever in a position, don't monkey with our survey results. If you have to, just don't take it. This definitely is something that creates some problems. So we're going to see kind of an uneven number over time, but we can deal with this in a couple of statistical ways. So let's talk about what the survey results look like. We're effectively, as I said, kind of in a period where we're seeing different presidents become more prominent for different reasons. So as it noted, Lincoln is obviously the top. We asked people to not only rate but rank the president, so we asked them on a scale of 1 to 100, what's your rating, and then we asked people to rank the presidents. Usually they correspond to each other, but not always. In this case, as I mentioned, Lincoln is the first, followed by Franklin Roosevelt. And what's interesting is that Franklin Roosevelt has jumped over George Washington in that spot. So Washington ends up taking a number 3 spot. Donald Trump, in contrast, is the lowest. His rating is about 10.9%. Why Roosevelt? Well, I'm going to explain a little bit about sort of the kind of clear polarization and partisanship that's happening in these surveys, but one of the reasons that we're seeing FDR pop on this is that there is a kind of renewed sense of kind of this architecture of government being useful, and the longevity of something like the New Deal is certainly something that scholars have been thinking a lot about. FDR also, as you know from your reading and from history, is a tremendously impactful president on the administrative state. Most people look at this period as being the beginning of modern presidency. So in a sense, it makes it important and useful to have him on this because he really did sort of usher in the kind of modern presidential state. The little bubbles here are a little small. You can find this on the website in a way you can blow it up, but you can basically see, kind of, as I mentioned, both the rating and rank of different presidents in this survey. So you can see at the very bottom there, kind of clustered together, are Lincoln, FDR, and George Washington. And what's interesting to me is that they kind of are all shrunk together into one little unit. So there's a pretty big difference between these 3 and then like the next grouping. So you can see that next grouping starting with Teddy Roosevelt, with Jefferson, Truman, and Obama, and then Eisenhower and LBJ. So there's a kind of real segmentation of these, which I think is sort of interesting. A lot of presidents at the bottom, and they kind of stagger in this ascending order here. You can see it, as I mentioned, Trump at the very bottom, Buchanan, Johnson, Pierce, and then Harrison at the very bottom. Harrison doesn't have much of a chance to become a great president since he dies almost immediately in office, so it's hard to kind of hold him accountable on that. But I'll talk a bit in a minute about kind of the ways that we treat uncertainty in this, which is obviously sort of a big issue. So just looking at some of the details here, specifically about kind of who ends up where, you can see that from the prior incarnations of the surveys, we can do some analysis to see kind of where people are moving on the survey, if they're moving at all. So for instance, Lincoln doesn't move. He's number 1, and that didn't change. But we did see, as I mentioned, Roosevelt jump up 1 spot, and Roosevelt goes down 1 spot. That middle group of the kind of upper echelon there, Roosevelt, Truman, Jefferson, basically about the same, didn't really move much, but we did see President Obama move up a lot from the first time he was on the survey in 2015 until the present moment. I'll talk more about Obama in a minute, but there's a lot of support for Obama in these ratings, so I'll talk about that in just a second to what we kind of think that might mean. Eisenhower's down a little bit. You see Johnson up a little bit and Kennedy up a little bit. Generally speaking, people are kind of more or less where they have been. We do see, though, a decline in presidents like Woodrow Wilson and Ronald Reagan. You can see them dropping many spots in that, and Joe Biden basically kind of takes that position right there at 14. We also see some interesting changes that do reflect that we have these changing norms and how we think about presidential ratings. So one of the examples we often point to is the example of Andrew Jackson. At 21 there in the current survey, you can see that between 2015 and 2024, he dropped a bunch of spots, about 12 spots. And part of the reason is that there's a kind of reassessment of Jackson's career and sort of his policies. And as a result, we're seeing those kind of new norms alter people's perception about his greatness. So again, it's a good reminder that basically greatness isn't fixed. It's not the kind of thing that we are set with forever. Even though Mount Rushmore is not getting any bigger, we don't necessarily see that there are kind of fixed preferences in terms of presidential greatness. So just to kind of give us this little summary here, Biden enters the ranking at 15, putting him in the top third of all presidents. We write this in our op-ed that we think this basically is sort of high, but what we think is happening is that this is really the kind of anti-Trump vote. So you're seeing basically people reacting to Joe Biden's presidency in reaction to Donald Trump's presidency. That makes sense because, as I said, we're sort of assume that we're going to see some greatness changes over time as people reassess what it means to be president and what it means to be a great president. That's also interesting to us because Biden's record isn't the kind of record we typically think of when we assess great presidents. Historically speaking, the predictors of great presidents include, like, you win a war, or you have few scandals, and you have more or less peace and prosperity. Those are the kind of factors. The other thing is what people call intellectual brilliance. People do surveys, and we do this too. We don't put as much stock in it since it's hard to know how smart somebody really is. We don't use SAT scores or GPA or anything like that. It's just a sort of assumption that people put in, and so it definitely is a hard thing to assess. But those are the factors that basically usually predict presidential greatness. And Biden doesn't really have any of those things. So as we said, sort of the number seems like it's a little high, but the reason it's high is because he's not Donald Trump. So, as I said, conversely, Donald Trump basically maintains a position at the bottom, along with other various calamitous chief executives, Buchanan, Johnson, Pierce, Harding, and then William Henry Harrison, who, of course, didn't have much time to make an impact on the world. So, as I mentioned, we also ask questions about Mount Rushmore. I will say, embarrassingly, that we ask people just flat out, who do you think should be the next president on Mount Rushmore? And a lot of people give us answers that include people who are currently on Mount Rushmore. And so perhaps it's the case that, like, people just don't know who's on Mount Rushmore, but we use this as an imperfect measure of, like, how we assess greatness, right? So again, we ask people, who's next, right? You know, if you didn't know, you can see the picture of who's on Mount Rushmore. And what we find is that Franklin Roosevelt, not surprisingly, is the person who they think should be next on Mount Rushmore by a wide margin, 65%. Obama came in second, which is really interesting. Part of the reason, again, is that we see the kind of post-war Democrats increasing their standing in this. That's one factor for sure, and that definitely is driven by partisanship, which I'll talk about in a second. But also, there's a good reason to think that Obama could be one of these great presidents. I mean, obviously, sort of racially, he's record-breaking historical win, and the kind of presence long-term of Obamacare certainly cements him among those presidents who have done these sort of massive policy changes that have changed the way people their role in government. So it's not uncommon or unreasonable to think he would be high on this list, but he certainly, for our scholars, says that he would be next on Mount Rushmore. We see sometimes Eisenhower pop on this. It's interesting. People will either say Eisenhower or Reagan. So one of the two of them usually gets on the kind of top 2 or 3 people who they think should be next on Mount Rushmore. So as I said, these people are scholars of the presidency, and the hope is that they're thinking about the world in a kind of balanced way, but they're human, like everybody, and they have partisan preferences, like everybody. And we wanted to make sure that, or to understand, kind of where it is people are coming from. So we can see here a ranked list of Republicans and Democrats. We also asked people their partisanship, so liberal or conservative. But we can really focus on those first 2 columns there, which is where the different partisans rank each of the different presidents. I will hasten to say that we don't have a lot of Republicans in the sample, right? Typically, kind of, the sort of academics will lean left. I think we had like maybe 20 people who registered or who said they were Republican. We do have more people who consider themselves moderates and sort of leaning conservative, so there's some modest variation, but honestly, mostly it's driven by the fact that most academics are pretty liberal. So you can see some interesting differences here, right? So basically what you want to look for is sort of the degree to which you see differences between Republicans and Democrats. You see a few. Even at the very top, right? Washington is the #1 for ranked president for Republicans, #3 for Democrats. You also see some small differences there for John Adams. There's actually a really good new book on John Adams called Making the Presidency, and the case is that basically Adams really does sort of cement the modern presidency as we think of it. And as a result, you're seeing kind of more people think of him as a stable, solid president. You see some differences based upon like Van Buren. You don't see many differences based upon on Harrison, right? People tend to see him about the same. People see Roosevelt about the same. So you can kind of stare at this table for a while and sort of see some of these differences that might explain what the uniqueness is between Republicans and Democrats. This is the top of the scale, right? This is sort of Washington to Teddy Roosevelt. This is the bottom of that scale, where you're likely to see some differences, right? This is where you get into the more modern era, and obviously partisanship has a kind of stronger sting when it comes here. So you can see some, just looking kind of at the very front to back, major differences. Biden is ranked 13 among Democrats and 30th among Republicans. The same is true for Trump, although you still see him at the bottom. He is perceived differently by both Republicans and by Democrats. Same is true for Obama, right? The 6th highest president for Democrats, but the 15th highest for Republicans, which is still pretty high. And here's another great example too. You can look at the 2nd President Bush, who obviously left office with some difficulties, right? The Iraq War, although now it seems sort of a distant memory, was definitely very partisan. And so you can see here, Democrats rank him 33, whereas Republicans rank him 19. So lots of interesting differences here, but the bottom line is this. Basically, partisanship does have something to tell us about the way people perceive greatness, which isn't at all surprising, right? Again, these are people who are understanding the political world in the way that is dictated often by their partisan preferences. So just to kind of summarize this, I can't believe I found this picture, but I literally went and Google searched like Clinton, Obama, Carter, and found this exact picture, which perfectly fit here, as you can see, to illustrate this point, which is that basically, as I said, look at the post-war Democrats all got a bump on this survey. How long that bump will last, I don't know. I don't know when we'll do the survey again. We'll have to see who kind of wins the election. We've typically done it in the middle of kind of president's term, so if Harris wins, then we'll probably do it midway through there. If Trump wins, we probably won't do it until after he's out of office. But you can see here for sure that post-war Democrats got a bump. Obama up to 7, Clinton up to 12, Carter up to 22. Many of them accomplished some pretty big things. Healthcare, peace and prosperity, an end to conflict in the Middle East for Carter. They have 2 Nobel Prizes among them, which we forget about. So obviously this is all a plus, but what we kind of assess is that the best thing that they have going for them in terms of these rankings is they're not Donald Trump. So again, Trump has a tremendous influence on what scholars thought of and how they assess presidential greatness. And I think that's really interesting. I'll talk in a second about kind of, we'll call it verbatims. Like when we ask people like, what makes a great president? because you're all thinking it, right? How would you assess what makes a great president? We don't tell them what we assume is true. We let them tell us what a great president is. And so we can get some interesting dimensions because of that. So I'll talk about that in a second. But I also want to talk about this, which I'm always fascinated by. And that's kind of which presidents are considered to be overrated and which presidents are considered to be underrated, right? Which presidents are just overhyped and which don't get enough attention. Jimmy Carter is consistently the most underrated president. He's selected by 64 people as the most underrated president. The number is 2.2 on average, and 1 is like the lowest point on this. So he, by a fairly healthy margin, is considered the most underrated, followed by Grant and George H.W. Bush. I was just in Midland at the former home of George H.W. Bush, which is a kind of cool little walk down memory lane. If you're ever in Midland and you're bored, which is most of the time you're going to be in Midland, head over to the Bush family house because it's kind of cool. You get to see kind of a little slice of life of the Bush family in the 1950s. Speaking of 1950s, Eisenhower is on this list pretty prominently, and then Johnson, and then Biden. So lots of underrated presidents. Overrated presidents, Kennedy is always at the top of this list. We've done the survey 4 times now, and he's always the person who's at the top of this list. But we also have presidents like Reagan and Jackson on that list, Wilson, Jefferson, and Teddy Roosevelt. So although some of them are on Mount Rushmore, they're still considered to be basically presidents who are overhyped. Maybe because they're on Mount Rushmore, there's a perception that they're kind of overhyped. So you can look at the specific numbers here, but you can basically see that by a lot, people consider Jimmy Carter to be the most underrated. I think you'll see a lot of assessment of Carter as he nears the end of his life. He had a pretty storied political career in a very short period. So I'm curious to see kind of how scholars assess his life and his presidency as the end of his life comes. So why do we do this? Well, as I mentioned, we want to know more about how presidents are seen through the eyes of scholars who study institutions of the presidency. So one question is, as I said, we ask people what makes a great president. And the reason it's useful for us to assess this in real time is that we can get a sense of how scholars think about the changing nature of presidential power and changing norms in the White House. So just to give you a sense of kind of tonally what this looks like. As I said, we've done the survey a couple different times, and I kind of cherry-picked, to me, the kind of modal response when we ask people what makes a great president. So in 2014, people responded generally that a great president has the capacity for institutional change, can meaningfully change the institution. In 2018, it was all about accomplishments, getting stuff done. And then in 2023, it's about preserving and promoting democracy. Do you see the trend? This is really, I think, why it's useful to study this, because we can get a sense of sort of how, in real time, people rethink the presidency and the kind of things they care about in terms of presidential power. We also, of course, as I mentioned, can explain how things work in real time. It is a different measure than like a survey measure, right? Some of you have seen the outcomes of the Gallup surveys. Maybe you've taken a Gallup survey where it asks you how well the job of president is being handled by whoever is president. This is simply one measure of the way we assess a good president. This measure is a different way and kind of more institutionally stable way. But we also, of course, know that we're not perfect. We are people who don't know everything about all these different presidents. So we ask people, how certain are you that you can make a fair assessment about a particular president? And so, not surprisingly, you see a lot of variation. Some people know a lot about certain presidents. We know a lot about Teddy Roosevelt. We know a lot about Ronald Reagan. But we don't know as much about James Taylor, right? Or about President Polk. Not surprisingly, Harrison is very low on our list of how certain people are about their rating. So we can model the degree to which people really know a lot about what presidents have done historically and how it fits into the big picture. Obviously, this gets us to sort of questions about why presidents get reelected. There's lots of scholarship on this question, right? We're looking at it kind of right now, right? We had for a while there, Biden versus Trump, and now we have Trump versus Harris. And the question is sort of, why does a public reelect a president? Why would the public reelect a person who's been out of office for 4 years? These are still kind of thorny questions that, although it seems obvious in retrospect, aren't things that we really know as scholars. So understanding this is really useful. I kind of call it the Harry Truman scenario. We see a difference between how a president might function politically in public and the kind of decisions that they make, which have lasting implications for the world. Harry Truman's a good example, right? He is, of course, somebody who initiates the final phase of World War II by literally dropping a bomb on on Japan at that point. And we see, of course, though, he's not getting reelected. So this is an odd sort of outcome when you'd expect to see this sort of translate into some kind of political success. He also got pushback from the military when it came to firing Douglas MacArthur, but he did fully and within his right as the commander-in-chief. Most every commander-in-chief would have done the same thing, but because McCarthy was so popular, he got pushback. So this is a way, as I said, sort of for us to understand kind of what greatness looks like in the scale of the institution itself. So it's a different kind of measure than just whether they get reelected or if they're popular at that time, which are lagging indicators at best of presidential greatness. So as I said, as a kind of bonus, I wanted to throw in some discussion about vice presidents, which we don't talk about very much. We asked people this question, we were curious about how we could parallel this, because we thought, well, some of the institution of the presidency is connected to the vice presidency. So we asked people, you know, what makes a great vice president? And I kid you not, at least 4 different people literally wrote pulse, which to me is a pretty good indication that, you know, we have a very low standard for what constitutes presidential greatness. But I find this interesting, and we got some kind of cool results. So this is a series of vice presidents since FDR. Some of them you may know well, some of you are like, who is that? So John Nance Gardner, you may know, who is from Texas and famously said that the vice presidency wasn't worth a warm bucket of spit. You have Henry Wallace, who was FDR's second vice president, and then all the way on through Kamala Harris. So you can see lots of variation here in terms of the kind of greatness rankings. The greatest vice presidents have thought to be Joe Biden and Al Gore, in part because they were policy advisors to the president. But if you kind of follow very closely after, you can see the George H.W. Bush, who had a strong relationship with President Reagan, and then Walter Mondale, who had really kind of revolutionized the role of the vice president under Jimmy Carter as the next grouping of people. One of the lowest was Spiro Agnew, who ends up getting indicted while in office and has to resign. If you are interested in scandals at all, there's a great series of books about Agnew called Bagman, which is hilarious to see that this would have all happened while a vice president was in office. So really interesting, worth reading. There's a podcast about it too if you are a podcast listener. So interesting variation here over time. But our question was sort of, you know, how and why does this fall as it does? So just to give you a kind of quickie summary here, you can see that there's a kind of sort of layers of this. The first layer of great vice presidents include Al Gore, Joe Biden, Lyndon Johnson, and then as I said, Bush and Mondale. The next tier include Ford, who really didn't have much time to do a lot as vice president, but definitely did one big thing, right, which was to eventually pardon Nixon. There's a sort of relationship there. Truman and Humphrey in that category as well. We thought that Dick Cheney would have a more sizable role as the vice presidential greatness, but I'll talk about in a second kind of where he fits. But I don't think that, you know, he sort of fully deserves to be in the second tier given how popular and how influential he was. The third tier include Harris, which is interesting, right? Because sort of I think what people were sort of partnering off of is that, you know, she had been, you know, kind of supposed to be in charge of the U.S. border, and that didn't go well for a while for various reasons. We also see other presidents here, or vice presidents here, were sort of forgotten about. Alvin Barkley, nobody remembers. Sorry, Alvin Barkley, you're down below. And of course, Agnew is at the very bottom because of the scandal. So you can see some interesting changes here over time. We asked people kind of on a different kind of series of specific items, you know, what is it that the vice president did, and how well did they do this? So you can see some differences based upon kind of the specific questions we asked them. In terms of ticket balancing, Biden is the top in terms of relations with Congress. Biden is at the top, but in terms of being a surrogate for the president, Gore was the top, and policy advisor, of course, he was the top too. Dick Cheney ends up pretty high, for instance, if you look down the list on policy advisor, his ranking there is quite high, but as a ticket balancer and in terms of relations with Congress, he didn't do as well, which I think ends up putting him in that kind of third tier of great vice presidents. We just did a quick word cloud here to see, kind of what people talk about when we ask them verbatim, kind of what it is that makes a great vice president. And so just, you can see a couple things pop here. Policy is a big one, agenda, office, ability, happily is there, and support. These are all things that, for us, give us a sort of indication that the best vice presidents are the ones who end up supporting the president and can basically fulfill the mandate of the rest of the institution itself.